There's a river flowing in my soul. There's a river.
In this two-part dialogue with Linda Darling-Hammond and Bob Pianta, we move from story to structure, from lived experience to developmental architecture. John King's story might, in another era, have been told as the Horatio Alger narrative of individual perseverance. But what we explore here is something far more consequential. John's experience was not just simply good fortune. It was the predictable result of conditions aligned with how human beings actually learn and develop. In Part A, The Relational Foundations of Learning, Linda and Bob illuminate that core premise. Drawing on neuroscience, developmental science, and decades of classroom research, they show that relationships are not sentimental additions to schooling. They are the medium through which cognition is activated and sustained. Bob and Linda surface a central tension. If learning is relational, why are so many schools still organized in ways that fragment relationships, isolate teachers, and privilege compliance over connection? Let me introduce our two panelists, two individuals from whom I've learned a great deal during many decades. As I introduce them, I want you to know that I hate hyperbole. Having said that, if anyone were to come to me and ask me who is the person in the US who knows most about policy and practice in education and how to make it better, I would say Linda Darling-Hammond. And if the same person or another person came to me and asked me who in this country knows the most about student-teacher relationship and how it affects learning in the classroom, I would say Bob Pianta. And we are blessed by the fact that both of them can join us today to expand upon John King's foundational conversation. So thank you for joining us. Let me start by quoting John King, who observed that the school ultimately is really about the relationship between a teacher and a student and the work in which they're engaged. Relationships, John said, are crucial. What Jim Comer once said, that relationships are to schools like location is to real estate. Relations are foundational. Bob and Linda, would you each elaborate on these points?
I think, of course, that is correct. And when we think about the science of learning and development, one of the things we know is that the brain develops, human beings develop based on relationships and experiences. And that is the stuff that school has to structure and support, is how do you create the right kind of relationships that are developmental in nature, in which people are both safe and secure with each other, but also growing and learning. And then how do you create the experiences that awaken the brain and curiosity and inquiry and enable the learning to occur. And I just start with one thought, which I know Bob will say a lot about how we build those strong teacher-student relationships. And then we also need to worry about student-to-student relationships because peers matter a lot. We have to build community and a sense of shared responsibility and mutual trust in the classroom. But I also want to note that we have to structure schools so that good relationships are possible. And we often lay it on the teacher to say, you need to develop relationships with your students. And I come to this having been a high school teacher where, 180 kids, 30 at a time, 6 periods a day would come through the factory model classroom in the kinds of schools where I taught. And you could care deeply and desperately about all of your students, but you could not care effectively for all of them in that structure. And so we now are building new kinds of high schools, middle schools also, that are organized to enable relationships. And that is as important as what teachers come to know and be able to do. They have to be in a setting where what they do can be effective relationship building. So in these schools, you'll have a team of teachers who may share 100 students, and they teach math and English language arts and science and social studies, and they share both the way in which they build the curriculum, and they talk about the students with each other and think about how to support them. You'll have an advisory system where every student is in a family group of 15 or 20 students, and the advisor is in touch with the parents and in touch with the other teachers, and where the student has a place to learn social and emotional skills and to develop the roots of belonging in the school and the classroom, etc. I won't go into all the details, but we have now thousands of schools that have begun to abandon the factory model assumption that you would just go along the assembly line from one teacher to another to be stamped with a lesson, to a setting in which the development of those relationships is possible and is supported and encouraged.
Let me add, as I go to Bob, that when John King was talking about Roxbury Academy, he talked about that type of structuring. Bob?
Thanks, David. Linda, those comments resonate so well with my own thinking about this topic, and with a tremendous amount of science. And also, to your point, they resonate with my personal experience. I had a great experience of starting my career as a special education teacher, where I was fortunate enough to be working in a middle school, a setting with 6th, 7th, and 8th grade kids. And I had the same kids for 3 years in a row. And about toward the end of my first year, I began to feel that kind of feeling you sometimes get as a first year teacher, where you just have a sense that you have your feet under you, and then the year ends and you have to start all over again, when you were actually really ready to get going with the kids that you just finished the year with. And so it was different for me, because I was fortunate enough to have the same kids the next year. And we were starting from a very different place of trust and confidence in one another. And both for me and for them, it was quite reciprocal. And I think part of that, honestly, was a formative experience that led me to a path to study this resource that I felt was very important, but not attended to: the relationships that students have with teachers. And particularly to study these relationships systematically. And I think about John's point, that schools are all about relationships. And I think about that point from a couple different angles that I think I can comment on here. So the first, like, if you asked any former student, current student, about learning something that was very important to them in their lives and what the key factor was that enabled that learning, I think to a person, they will describe a relationship with a teacher or a mentor or a coach that provided the Vygotskian combination of support and challenge to learn something that was both meaningful and difficult at the same time. I think that this characterization of the importance of relationships speaks to the role they have as a motivating factor, as kind of an on-ramp to students' engagement. But then there's another angle that Linda pointed out very well, and that's what we know from developmental science about relationships and their connection to cognition. And this is where the alignment between developmental science and education policy and practice is not particularly strong. But we certainly have learned a lot from cognitive neuroscience in the last several years about the connection between social relationships, the actual experiences that people have with one another when they're interacting, and the ways that those social relationships are connected to basic cognitive processes. There's a great stream of research that has connections to one of my colleagues at UVA, Jim Cohen, in which we study the connection between social processes, particularly relationships, and performance on cognitive tasks. And in a particular experiment where we would be monitoring students' brain activity as they're thinking through a series of cognitive tasks, but we'd be doing that under conditions in which the student is exposed to information about a particular teacher they have a close relationship with, or a particular teacher where that relationship is more neutral. And when you bring to the student's performance in the task, when you expose the student to information about the teacher with whom they have a close relationship, you see a burst of neurological energy that can be made available for cognition. It is really striking to see this. And we know, even though we know anecdotally about the connection between relationships and brain activity, we're now beginning to fill in some of the science behind it. And the third point I'd want to make about relationships is that I think, if we look at from a broad perspective, if we look at our theories of learning, our theories of schooling, and the mechanisms of schooling, I think we would notice a misalignment between those theories and what we know about the fundamentals of human development. And I think the more that we can understand the importance of relationships and then begin to see how teachers can enact the little moves, the kind of things they do when they're welcoming kids into a classroom, and the big moves that can be created by policies when we create contexts like looping for kids and teachers for the same several years in a row. And then when we can begin to shift the emphasis of teacher preparation programs, then if we kind of combine these little and big moves that align our schooling with our theories and knowledge about human development, then we begin to see how we can move from a sense of being lucky to have a great relationship with a teacher to a sense of that being a guarantee.
And the reason we have to be so deliberate about it is that we inherited this sort of factory model that did not envision relationships being the least bit important. In fact, the goal of schooling was to select and sort. You put the kids on the assembly line, which was Henry Ford's great invention of that time. And they were supposed to, the kids who couldn't manage it were supposed to fall off and go into the factories and so on. There was not an intention to support kids to succeed. There was an intention to give this sort of very basic education and let kids sort themselves out into different walks of life. One of the things I just want to note, because I've appreciated it, Bob, is the way you built the interactions between adults and kids into the class instrument, which is one of the things we use in California throughout our early childhood system as a way to, as part of the quality assurance system, so to speak. So you can begin to instantiate understandings about what can be helpful to kids in more regularized policy settings. We're doing the same thing now with a statewide high school redesign initiative to build relationships into the design of the school, and then to teach teachers how to be able to take advantage of that. And so I just think that intentionality is so key. When I went to New York, I learned a lot about schools like that Debbie Meyer and others were starting. Brought that to California. I was asked to help start a high school in a very high-need community in East Palo Alto, where kids were dropping out, 2/3 were not graduating, and so on. And we built this sort of small school on that design with 100% of kids graduating, 90% going to college, not because we mastered every technique of instruction, although there was a lot of work on instruction going on, but in large part because we really developed the relationship base that allowed them to be personally known. And then, of course, as a student, you know a lot about how they learn. And you say, oh, this is going to really help this student. This is really going to help that student. So I just want to reinforce the points that you were making and the intentionality that we need to have about bringing this into the way we do school.
I think this again resonates so well with what we've been thinking and writing about. A colleague of mine, a journalist, Howard Blumenthal, and I just put together a book on kids all across the world who describe their learning experiences. And most of what we're saying here about the conditions that support their learning resonate with what those students have told us. You can't come away from those interviews without feeling good about these kids and what they bring to their lives and to their schools and to their communities. And then at the same time, you can also see how our current model, this factory model of schooling, is just crammed with standards after standards after standards and tests after tests. We educators and policymakers have created environments in which there's almost no space for the kind of exploration and learning process that we're describing here, and the kind of relational development that needs to go on so that teachers can serve a role that's only going to be more important, particularly as technology begins to absorb some part of teachers' instructional role. Students in our interviews say that they need their teachers to play a role in building personal connections with them and in scaffolding their engagement in projects focused on their own personal interests. And as education becomes more technologically mediated, it's going to be even more important to support those teachers to be able to do the relational side of their work very well.
Bob, your point about the press on schools is, I think, very important. A decade ago, I was on an ASCD site team that went to Finland, a place that Linda's been at. And it was a typical one. I was a token researcher. There was a token school state superintendent and a school superintendent and teacher of the year. When we debriefed, our core takeaway was that Finland was doing more by demanding less. It was really giving people the slack to be creative. Now, obviously, as Linda's talked about in her writings and things like that, it also includes good, solid teacher preparation and support for teachers, et cetera, et cetera. And there's the whole welfare system that really enables things. But I think your point about if we believe in relationships, we both have to structure it, as Linda was talking about it, but we also then have to enable it, which means also taking our foot off the pedal and let the magic happen when people are connected to each other. So let me go back to John King. And one of the things that he talked about at Roxbury Prep was the fact that they not only focused on relationships, but they focused on building community, something that Linda mentioned for a second before. And so I would invite each of you to elaborate on the importance of a learning community and including peers.
Early in my graduate career, I had a chance to read a book by James Garbarino. And in this work, he was mostly studying vulnerable kids who were growing up with challenges of their own or in challenging areas, and was expressing this very rich elaboration of what a social network and a community really mean for kids growing up. For example, what does it mean when the adults who are important to you know each other and have your development and your welfare as a focus, and that you benefit when they're speaking to each other, oftentimes in ways that you don't or are not even aware of? And for me, that just anchored this notion of a social network, a social community as a very real thing that for many kids serves as a safety net or a launching pad or a support system. You know, in these ways, community is very real and very real in the lives of kids. And oftentimes we identify community in its absence rather than its presence. We recognize its value when it's not there. And, communities do all sorts of things for the development of children and youth. They set social norms and expectations and goals so that there's a common framework that kids can understand about the paths and resources available to them. Communities do things like organize time, or they structure settings in ways that align with kids' needs. And sometimes that's for individual kids and sometimes for large groups of kids. And I think we know very well that communities play a very big role in cultural and individual identities that are very important for kids, particularly as they're starting to hit middle school. I think, again, John's wisdom in the quote about community is to call out community as a very explicit entity that we often have a hard time identifying, but it's very real and requires explicit attention and support. Anytime I walk into a school where a community is alive, you can recognize it in the energy, in the ways that people are engaging both within the school and particularly the way the school's embedded with the families of the kids that are attending there.
So just to build on the intentionality of building community, it is something that you have to be explicit about doing as a teacher. It's got to be part of teacher preparation. How do you build a community in your classroom in which there's respect between and among all the students, in which there's responsibility, in which kids have responsibilities, in which they come to develop empathy? Of course, the emphasis on social emotional learning is one strategy for beginning to build that kind of community. And we've had this tension. Is that a waste of time? Does that distract you from doing the math or something? But the evidence base is very strong. We published a piece recently at Learning Policy Institute looking at 12 meta-analyses of social emotional learning across the world with hundreds of studies, which routinely find not only kids feeling more attachment and sense of belonging and capacity to manage their lives, but also schools being safer places and students achieving at higher levels. Because when you're in a community setting where you can trust those around you to be in your corner, so to speak, then your brain is able to open up and do the thinking and work that it needs to do without being basically flooded with cortisol, that the stress hormone, which happens when you are stigmatized, when you're worried about whether, you are going to be misunderstood. The stereotype threat work that Claude Steele and others have done about how if you have identities that are stigmatized in society, you carry a sort of toxic stress load with you that actually demonstrably interferes with cognition and performance. And so you've got to create these safe spaces, and there are ways to do that. This is not just to be left to chance. The social emotional learning curriculum are one set of ways of organizing some of that. We're seeing in schools that adopt restorative practices, which include community meetings in which students are regularly sharing their experiences and feelings, in which they also have opportunities to learn conflict resolution strategies as well as strategies for cooperation and getting along, that you see both better mental health outcomes and better achievement outcomes. We see this in places that use complex instruction, which is an instructional strategy that Liz Cohen and Rachel Lotan have worked on for years, and many others around the world, which teach kids to collaborate well in groups and have a very specific and explicit ways to build intellectual community that allows for the best use of our brains individually and collectively. So I just want to say that community is not only important, it's something that you can be very intentional and need to be intentional about building. It needs to be a big part of teacher education. It's not just content pedagogy or learner pedagogy, it's also community pedagogy. You need to have a way to create that. And I think you mentioned Finland early on. And one of the things they did was infuse developmental science throughout every part of the educational system, including the childcare system. They have very skilled practitioners who deeply understand child development. They put that at the heart of their very rigorous master's degree program to become a teacher. They also put the understanding of how children learn differently and special education pieces of it. They figured that if teachers learn to teach the kids who might have the more unique ways of learning or the greater needs, that they would be able to teach all students. But that also created a way by which teachers look and listen carefully and understand and build on diverse ways of learning with a developmental frame. And I think that drove a lot of the success in Finnish schools, along with the fact that they really value teachers as researchers. To be admitted to Finnish teacher education program, you actually get several research articles that you have to interpret and respond to on the exam for admissions. And then you have to do a research thesis about practice as part of your preparation to become a teacher. And so what you then have is a body of professionals who are grounded in how people learn and always looking to learn more about how to teach the particular kids that they have in their classroom. And that's part of that intentionality.
Do you want to add anything, Bob?
I agree completely with Linda's perspective. Social connections to learning are rich and textured and valuable. One of the things that we've noticed in our work with relationships between children and teachers is the way that those relationships have impacts of long-term value for their learning and thinking. And that value of those relationships is connected to the fundamental importance of teachers and children learning to take one another's perspective. In a learning community, the teacher has to take the student's perspective in order to make that learning relevant. And relevant content, in turn, helps build that connection, both with the teacher, but even more importantly, across the classroom of kids who are also trying to build community. Activities in social emotional learning are fundamentally geared toward that skill of learning to take somebody else's perspective. And that shared perspective that emerges out of those activities are a real resource that carries kids along and makes them a community and can make a dyadic relationship a real resource for learning.
It means that the teacher's social and emotional learning is
Totally.
equally important, that we all come into teaching from whatever our family backgrounds were, whatever it was that we experienced in school. We carry these ideas about how you handle things and react. And those are not always, perhaps even mostly, informed by a strong set of both principles and behaviors and understandings and actions that are well informed about how to create a strong communal, collaborative community. And so teachers have to learn this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things that we've worked on, I know Bob and I have both worked on the teacher education front, is how do you construct teacher education so that teachers are experiencing what it is that they're going to have to do themselves, right? Both experiencing it and then debriefing it and understanding the ways in which respond to students, and then how do you learn more about what's really behind whatever the statement or the action or whatever it is, and then how do you take a deep breath and center yourself. Mindfulness for teachers as well as for students can be very important. So that's a whole area of the curriculum that's just being developed, I think, in teacher education, and fundamentally important for these kinds of settings in which students are getting the supports that they need.
A connection to the issues that you've both been talking about is the work of Kimberly Schoeneck-Reichel, who will be on in another foundational session, where she did this study with a colleague in 2016, where on the one hand, they were teaching teachers to be more mindful. And at the same time, the consequence of that mindfulness was less cortisol. And when they measured, student cortisol levels went down as well. And I'm raising that because I think it's both teacher social and emotional learning, but also teacher well-being, which gets back to the other issues that have been talked to before.
Yeah.
As we segue into a next set of questions, when I was listening to both of you, I was thinking about an episode on Edutopia called Teaching Math as a Social Activity, which came from Anchorage, Alaska, and I think was probably a responsive classroom teacher school because of the fact that the teacher built on the student created norms for how they would work together. But what was interesting in that video is not just how they use those norms, but as young people were talking about how they were thinking about math problems, you could look at the eyes of the other young people and you could see that they were seeing, oh, there's another way that I can think about this. And that is so intellectually as well as socially powerful. In this two-part dialogue with Linda Darling-Hammond and Bob Pianta, we move from story to structure, from lived experience to developmental architecture. John King's story might, in another era, have been told as one of Fluck and Pluck, the Horatio Alger narrative of individual perseverance. But what we explore here is something far more consequential. John's experience was not just simply good fortune. It was the predictable result of conditions aligned with how human beings actually learn and develop. In Part A, The Relational Foundations of Learning, Linda and Bob illuminate that core premise. Drawing on neuroscience, developmental science, and decades of classroom research, they show that relationships are not sentimental additions to schooling. They are the medium through which cognition is activated and sustained. Bob and Linda surface a central tension. If learning is relational, why are so many schools still organized in ways that fragment relationships, isolate teachers, and privilege compliance over connection? Let us continue with Part B, from developmental science to systemic change.